With us, Roger Nord, Deputy Director of the Capacity Institute at the IMF. Roger, welcome.
Thank you, George. It's great to be here. I'm delighted to represent the International Monetary Fund at Ideagen's annual Global Leadership Summit.
Well, it's an exciting moment in time for a lot of different reasons, Roger. And when I say it's great to have you on Ideagen TV for this Global Leadership Summit, we mean it wholeheartedly, especially with the incredible role that the IMF has played and is playing during this critical time. And so to kick off this interview, Roger, can you share with our global audience a little bit about yourself and what you do at the IMF?
Sure, George. Let me say a few things about the IMF first for our viewers. The IMF is an international organization, has 190 member countries across the world, and our objective is to foster global monetary cooperation and financial stability. Now, we do this in three ways. Basically, we periodically assess economic conditions, we recommend economic policies to enable sustainable growth, and we do this typically annually in all our member countries, from the United States to the smallest Pacific island. Our second mode of engagement is by providing short-term financing to countries that are in financial trouble, and that's probably what the IMF is best known for. And finally, we provide technical assistance and training, which we call capacity development, in the areas of IMF expertise to help countries implement sound economic policies. And within the IMF, I have held a variety of positions, both in Washington and overseas, and currently I'm in charge of the IMF's global partnerships to support our capacity development activities. And there our focus is essentially on low-income countries with a primary objective to help them modernize their economic policies and institutions and make progress to the sustainable development goals. We do that from our headquarters in Washington, but also through a network of 17 regional centers around the globe, which provide technical assistance and training in close proximity to beneficiaries. We run those centers in partnership with the member countries themselves, but also with development partners. This is a unique setup. It is demand-driven. It gathers development players all around the same table. And finally, we also have a dozen or so of thematic funds that focus specifically on areas of IMF expertise, ranging from fighting anti-money laundering and terrorism financing to strengthening debt, natural resource, wealth management. Back to you.
You know, Roger, that was an incredible description of the work that you're doing, primarily because you can tell that you're helping to lead this effort and you're excited about this work because you're truly making a difference. And that is the authenticity that's so incredible about this conversation already. We just came off what was a challenging year in 2020, to say the least. Perhaps for the first time in human history, we encountered headwinds that really no one could have expected. And yet, leadership today is more crucial than ever. That's why I stand in awe of the leadership that you're exhibiting at the IMF and the work that you're doing, because it takes that leadership that's setting the tone to help us get to the other side, to reimagine, which is what you're doing. You're reimagining the operations. In addition to rebuilding, you're reimagining for more efficiencies, etc. And so, Roger, what does leadership mean to you? And why is it so important?
Well, George, you're right. I mean, tackling the greatest global challenge of our times requires leadership. And because of the global nature of this challenge, it requires strong international institutions as well to provide a framework for this leadership. It requires global cooperation to tackle the impact of the pandemic, protect lives and livelihoods, and it also requires a global dialogue to learn from each other, to translate this learning into more effective policies. The World Health Organization, for example, provides this framework for international cooperation in the area of health. And for the IMF, the IMF was born out of the ashes of World War II and the bitter experience of the inward-looking policies of the 1930s, its guiding philosophy, then as now, is that dialogue and mutual support are much better than conflict and protectionism. This quality and the leadership that the IMF can provide to help countries address the impact of the economic crisis, this is now needed to support countries struggling with the biggest hit to their economies in living memory. So as we go from crisis to recovery, this leadership will become even more important, and the IMF certainly stands ready to play its role in that process.
Well, and it's truly remarkable. It's truly remarkable, and as you said, the IMF was born out of a difficult moment in history, and here you are again, helping to rise to the challenge of helping the most vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable populations on the planet, to help to rebuild and to reimagine their lives and their countries. And so what an incredible opportunity to really think through how the IMF can do that. And so what are some examples, Roger, of some of the programs and impact that the IMF is having in these vulnerable countries, especially during this emergence out of this global pandemic?
Let me try to give you a few examples of how we try to respond with what I think is really unprecedented speed and magnitude to help countries, notably to protect the most vulnerable and set the stage for an economic recovery. Let me start by mentioning three things in particular. First, we extended emergency financing now to 85 countries, as that's about half of our membership, mostly low-income countries, at record speed. We've now done so to the tune of about $100 billion. Second, we granted debt service relief to 29 of the IMF's poorest and most vulnerable member countries. This was made possible through the strong support from our donor partners. And in that context, we also called on bilateral creditors to suspend debt service payments from the poorest countries to them. And the G20 group of countries responded to this call last year by agreeing to suspend repayment of all official bilateral credit from the poorest countries until the end of 2020. And this was then extended until mid-2021. And third, of course, at the same time, we've been providing policy advice and capacity development support to virtually our entire membership to help countries implement policies needed to overcome this crisis. That is, protect the most vulnerable and build a strong and lasting recovery. This is a crucial and often underappreciated role of the IMF. As I said, we are often in the headlines because of the financial support that we provide. But of course, as countries ramp up spending, it's all the more important to strengthen public financial management, to ensure that money is well spent, to safeguard financial stability, preserve the ability of financial sectors to support the economy, and to improve the collection of economic data, so to make more and better information available to economic decision makers. All of these things are areas where the IMF has expertise in which we share with our member countries. And then looking forward, as economies begin to recover, it will be important to restore battered tax systems. As I said, in all of these areas, we do have a lot of experience. We share this experience through our centers around the world to countries which we hope will help them find a way through and out of this crisis. Thank you.
Roger, what an incredible journey, as you described it, that the IMF role is playing, especially again during this time. And so I'd like to shift a bit to where we began with the global goals, those 17 global goals of the United Nations that we're all supporting, trying to create awareness on, and ultimately achieve. Roger, do you believe that the global pandemic and the resulting issues around it for these countries has set us back on achieving the goals by 2030?
I think this is a major concern. The current crisis is exacerbating existing challenges and has made it even more difficult, particularly for low-income countries. Low-income countries that have far fewer resources than the advanced economies to try to buffer the shock, if you will, for their citizens. So we do expect this to result in a setback, and gains in poverty reduction, for example, are going to be much more difficult to achieve. And we already see it in Africa, where for the first time in living memory, economies shrank in 2020. So before the crisis, we estimated that most emerging market economies could finance the additional spending needed to achieve these sustainable development goals through domestic actions, for example, by raising tax revenues or improving spending efficiency. We also, pre-pandemic, believed that low-income countries needed significant additional financing, including from the private sector. When we now look at the world, we see that most low-income countries and emerging market countries have higher spending needs, but they also have a more limited ability to mobilize revenue domestically. So this makes the SDG timeline very daunting. Bottom line, we believe poorest countries will need more support, both through concessional loans and grants, to minimize the scarring effects of the pandemic. And the international community has a big role to play in that. That includes the IMF, with all of our partners around the world. We think that the emergency lending has benefited overwhelmingly low-income and fragile countries, and our policy advice and capacity development that I was talking about before is directly relevant for the sustainable development goals. But an important agenda remains, notably in the area of climate change. This is a prime area that can be addressed only through international cooperation. It is encouraging that leaders around the world are willing to work together to fight climate change, and the IMF, for its side, is also stepping up its work in that area.
Incredible. And as we look at the IMF, you all regularly speak about building forward better. How does this actually play out in the real world? How do you build forward better?
Well, I think the underlying philosophy there is that while we focus right now on an emergency response, we need to at the same time keep our eye also on the ball going forward. All these immense public spending programs, where these programs can be put in place, they shouldn't rebuild yesterday's economy. They should be building the economy of tomorrow. So what we've been calling for is a synchronized investment in green and digital infrastructure. We have encouraged governments to put in place public investments as well as incentives for private investments that support low carbon, climate resilient growth. These could be efficient mass transit systems, smart electricity grids, and not least the phasing out of harmful subsidies. We estimate that a combination of green investments and appropriate carbon pricing could put us on a path towards net zero emissions by mid-century and create millions of new jobs. And similarly, we know that the economy of the future will be digital. So countries need to enable a planned transition by investing in digital infrastructure, be it e-commerce, e-learning, e-government, or digital money and payments. At the IMF, we're moving fast in both of these areas. We're incorporating climate change into our country and financial risk assessments. We're also scaling up capacity development in this area. We're working with countries to harness new digital technologies to become an engine of growth and financial inclusion, while maintaining adequate safeguards also against the new risks that inevitably accompany such a transition. And finally, we're trying to leverage this technology ourselves. Our interview today is a testament of that, and we have shifted, of course, as everybody, to working in the virtual world. And for example, we've massively expanded our online learning program which reaches in particular many low-income and developing countries, both government officials, but also students, civil society, and the public at large.
And that, if that's not inspiring for our global audience, I'm not sure what would be. At Ideagen, Roger, as you know, we've been focused on creating, fostering, connecting the dots on cross-sector partnerships to help to develop that critical partnership infrastructure to help to achieve the global goals by 2030. And I know, especially based on this discussion today and all we've seen at the IMF throughout the years, that partnerships are at the core of what you do. Roger, how important are these global partnerships across sectors to your work at the IMF?
Well, George, in one word, it's crucial and is absolutely central. As an international organization, we rely on partnerships. Of course, in the first instance, our partners are the 190 member countries. But one of the things I think I've discovered, or that we have discovered at least over the last 2 decades, is that broader partnerships are essential to making economic policy recommendations heard and implemented. And at a global level, we partner with other international organizations, but also with civil society, universities, foundations, and of course the private sector. And our regional offices do the same at the regional level. For example, in Africa, we typically launch our semi-annual economic outlook for Africa in partnership with local think tanks or universities. And that vastly increases the reach and traction of these reports. And of course, for IMF's capacity development activities, which I oversee on the financing side, we work with more than 40 partners, primarily countries and intergovernmental organizations, but also some foundations. And we truly see those partners as shaping the work, not merely as donors, but truly as partners where we have a common objective to help countries improve their economic policies and institutions.
And so as we look at these opportunities, especially with the backdrop of the 17 global goals of the United Nations, we've taken note that you're now increasingly focused, and you've alluded to this in this interview today, on goal number 13, climate change. Why?
Well, you know, while the pandemic is currently and logically, you know, the number one focus both for the IMF and I would say for all governments, but the economic implications of climate change may be even more far-reaching over the medium term. So we think of climate change at the IMF as a fundamental risk to economic and financial stability. It is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reinvigorate growth, create new green jobs. Our research has shown that combining steadily rising carbon prices with a green infrastructure push could boost global GDP growth over the next 15 years, every year, by about 0.7%. Sounds small, but in dollar terms, it's huge. And it will generate work for millions of people. So, concretely for the IMF, this means actions in 4 areas. First, we're integrating climate in our annual country economic assessments that I was talking about before. In highly vulnerable countries, we focus on adaptation, and we are building up mitigation analysis as well, including carbon pricing, which we think is crucial as one way to combat climate change. Second, we're including climate-related financial stability risks in our financial sector surveillance through the standard disclosure of risks, enhanced stress tests, and assessment of supervisory frameworks to take into account the risks that climate change can pose for financial sectors. Third, we're scaling up climate in our capacity development to help equip finance ministries, central banks with the skills needed to take climate considerations into account. And finally, last but certainly not least, we're mainstreaming climate indicators in our macroeconomic data. We'll launch a climate change dashboard this year with indicators to track the economic impact of climate risks and the measures taken to mitigate.
You know, Roger, your plate is full, and it's incredible. It's absolutely inspiring to hear all of the focus and all of the impact that you're making at the IMF. It's truly astounding. And so I'd like to ask, in addition to everything you've outlined, what are your goals for 2021 and beyond as we seek to emerge? We are hopeful that the planet is now emerging, preparing to emerge from this global pandemic. What are those goals that you have set for your work at the IMF?
You know, first and foremost, and I think I would speak for everyone here, is what we would like to see is a global vaccination campaign that allows us to exit from this pandemic and crisis in a coordinated way and avoid a dangerous divergence between high-income economies with broad access to vaccines and low-income countries with poor access. I think that would be a mistake, and we are fully supportive of the COVAX initiative, for example, that tries to make sure that we look at this as a truly global challenge that needs a global solution. Of course, in a more specific way, in my current capacity, I want to make sure that the IMF is equipped to continue to respond to the needs of countries, notably in the area of capacity development. As I said, we work with partners, and so we are always in fundraising mode. We have set ourselves an objective to raise an additional $100 million to help countries specifically face the challenges related to COVID-19, and that's an objective which my team is working very hard on. Those, I think, are what I see as the key goals for 2021. But let me repeat, this cannot be done by one institution alone. It requires partnerships. It requires working together. It requires global, regional cooperation. And the IMF is ready and indeed is very much at the center of this cooperation, and we will keep it that way in 2021.
And you have a trusted partner in us always, Roger, as you know. And so as we conclude this incredible interview, this incredibly inspiring interview, what is your call to action for our global audience? And how can our global audience find out more about your work at the IMF?
And this is probably the prime example of a challenge where all of humanity is in it really together. We have spoken often of global challenges. Well, this is truly a challenge on an unprecedented global scale. So we're in this all together, and we all need to play that role. And that role stretches from businesses and civil society to international financial institutions like the IMF. No one can do this alone, but together we can achieve what I think we all desire, which is to steer the world economy safely out of this pandemic, and in particular to make sure that the most vulnerable, both most vulnerable countries around the world, but also the most vulnerable in our own societies, are not left behind. You can find out more about the IMF at imf.org, and about capacity development in particular, about imf.org/capacity development. We're also on social media, Twitter, where we have our handle at IMFCapDev. Thank you.
Roger Nord, Deputy Director of the IMF Institute for Capacity Development. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your inspiration. And thank you for the impact you're making on the planet at the IMF.
George, you're most welcome, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.